Hello everyone. Today's lecture is a continuation of Kant's deontological ethics. However, to ground what is to come ahead in a proper context, I am providing you here a recapitulation of what we did in the previous lecture. And what it was? How Kant went about his business of arriving at general principles that can be offered as justifications for human acts and investigating the nature of such general principles thereof. Kant was, as I have told you earlier, in search of universal principles or maxims, you can say, that can be used by anyone to rationalize their acts. However, to do so, he wanted to rely on human nature, unlike as it is found in, say, scriptures, where the general principles are a divine gift, generally offered to us in the form of revelations. So, what is this human nature? Well, for Kant, human is an autonomous being who is capable of exercising his free will, relying on what can be called as inalienable elements of nature, that is, human interests or desires and rationality. And his concern, if you remember, was to understand whether humans can arrive at universal principles or maxims that can be used to justify their acts, relying on this nature of theirs, this nature that differentiates them from other non-human animates and inanimates, that is, once again, our interests or desires and our capacity to be rational agent. Now, what he contended was that if we rely on our desires or interests, that's one of the components of human nature, right? To arrive at such principles, what we manage to achieve are the principles that are conditional in nature, meaning you need to adhere to those only in certain specific conditions. For example, eat in moderation if you want to live a healthy life, or if you want to score well, study hard. Now, without such specific conditions, such as living a healthy life, you do not really need to eat in moderation. I mean, if you still wish to, you could, but in the absence of the condition of healthy living, eating in moderation is no more binding on you. So, basically, adherence to such commands is required only if it furthers your goals, it meets your desires, it serves your interests. Kant called such principles hypothetical imperatives, meaning commands that are conditional. For Kant, however, morality cannot be based on such conditional commands, such hypothetical principles, such hypothetical imperatives. Moral commands are to be unconditional for him, or what he calls them to be categorical. Now, the question is how to arrive at such principles relying on human nature. Well, Kant contends that relying on rationality, the faculty of reasoning it is, that makes us rational agents in fact, and also happens to be another essential component of human nature that we discussed, one can arrive at principles that are universal in nature. So what is it that we are saying? That if we rely on the other component of our nature, which is rationality, we would be able to arrive at universal principles, meaning regardless of the conditions, at all times and for all human beings without any exceptions, such principles must be adhered for justifying our acts. He called such principles as categorical imperatives. Now, these are the commands that are to be adhered or followed by all and at all times unconditionally. That means what? That they have to be followed regardless of whether these commands are fulfilling your goals, they are fulfilling your desires or interests. So, for example, the command do not lie. So, and again, another command do not kill. You need to adhere to these commands even when to do otherwise is in your interest. For an instance, a small lie like, say, calling sick to work when you are not really, right? And you are doing that to be able to, say, help your younger sister with her homework, or maybe you are calling sick to work when you are not to take your parents to the hospital, and maybe this particular lie is in your interest, or maybe it is in the interest of your sister, your parents, right? But Kant forbids you to do so, as morality for him is what? An unconditional command. And that is where you can really contrast his thesis with consequentialism in general and utilitarianism that you did before we started with Kant's deontological ethics in particular. Now, Kant would say here that if you do something for the sake of furthering happiness, either of your own or maybe of others, of the rest of the people, of everyone, right? You are acting on hypothetical imperative. Meaning, had your act not led to the desired consequences, you would not have acted in that manner. Happiness, therefore, is only a conditional good for him. And it is in this sense that Kant argues that goodwill is the only unconditional good. Now, what is goodwill? Well, it is to determine what ought to be done and to act with a sense of duty. And it is in this particular spirit that we call Kantian ethics to be duty for the sake of duty. Alright, so what would be to act out of goodwill? Doing your duty for the sake of duty. Acting with a sense of duty. Now, categorical imperative offers you such a principle or maxim that a rational agent ought to follow while exercising his free will, of course, also to make decisions. Now, this is all something that we had covered the last time as well, right? Now, having understood the conception of categorical imperative, it is reasonable to ask how a rational agent exercising its capacity for reason can arrive at such principles that are universal and therefore can act as a justification for an act without any exception. Now, this is the place where Kant has provided us with what is generally termed as three formulations of categorical imperative. One can understand these formulations or conceive them as some sort of a test or maybe a check, or you can say a signal or direction to follow when you are trying to formulate or arriving at such general principles, so that the principles arrived at are truly categorical in nature, right? The principle that you are arriving at is truly a categorical imperative, which is what? A command that is unconditional, a command that is not conditional. Now, what are these three formulations? So, let us have a look at that now. So, Kant's first formulation of categorical imperative is what? So, he would say that, I am quoting Kant himself here, that act only according to a maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. What does it all mean now? Alright. So, as you can see, this formulation of the categorical imperative has two components first of all. So, first, Kant requires you to ask what rule you would be willing to follow while exercising your will. Such a rule, he says, will be the maxim for your act. Meaning, you can use this rule as a justification for the performance of such an act. So, what are we saying? So, for instance, if I am to act in a certain way, what is it that I have to ask from myself? That what is the rule that I would be following if I would be acting in such a manner? So, for instance, if I happen to be hungry and I want to steal the lunch of my co-worker because I happen to be hungry, I do not want to eat the outside food. So, here if I would be stealing the food, I have to ask myself what is the principle that I would be acting on. So, in this particular case, what would be the principle? That stealing is right, that you may steal, that's the number one demand. Now, he needs you to follow one more condition, failing which such a rule can't be the maxim that you hoped it would be. And what is the maxim here? The maxim that you are acting from is that stealing is right. What was your act? That you wanted to steal the lunch of your co-worker, of your friend, right, in order to satiate your hunger. That was the particular action. To act in that particular manner, I wanted to know what is the maxim that I would be following. The maxim was that stealing is right. Now, in order that this maxim is something that can be followed, right, takes us to the second component of this formulation. What is that? Well, now once we have arrived at that maxim that stealing is right, we have to ask ourselves whether we would be willing to make our maxim a universal law. Meaning, would you allow your rule, would you allow your maxim of stealing is right to be followed by everyone at all times without any exceptions? And now you have your answer, that why you stealing the lunch of your friend perhaps is a wrong action. Because if you universalize it, what you are really saying is that everybody at all times can steal it, can steal everybody's lunch, right? It's absolutely all right. And that precisely does what people would stop trusting each other, right? If stealing becomes the norm, and forget about stealing the lunch, we are acting on a general maxim, which is what stealing is, right? If stealing is the norm in a society, right, it is perhaps that kind of a society where we can't trust each other. All right, now what do you learn from this particular example? So what was the first step here? When you were going to act, you had to find out first of all what is the maxim that you would be following if you would be acting in that particular way, right? In this particular case, what was the maxim? That you have to, you were saying that stealing is right. Now, in the second step, what you had to do was you had to know that whether you can universalize that particular maxim of yours, and then if for that question, if your answer is in affirmative, then your maxim is a duty you must follow, and the act performed by you is morally permissible. Otherwise, it is morally unacceptable an act, which happens to be the case with this particular scenario that we have just taken. Alright, so this happens to be the first formulation, right, of Kant. What is the second formulation of the categorical imperative then? Well, it states that act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. Now, this particular formulation perhaps should be understood in the light of Kant's views on human dignity as explained earlier. Now, humans, if you remember from the previous lecture, according to Kant, deserve a dignity or intrinsic worth that cannot be ascribed to other existence, such as animals or objects. Humans exhibit interests or desires, and to pursue such interests, they are capable of exercising their free will. Likewise, humans are rational agents also, who can exercise their free will to make their own decisions, set their own goals, and guide their conduct by reason. Now, these two factors, that is to have interests, to have desires, that means also, right, to have goals, and to be rational agent, confers human with a self-worth that cannot be ascribed to other beings and objects. Kant, according to our current understanding of the animal world, may be wrong in not ascribing interest to animals, but objects definitely do not have interests or rationality, right? So I took the example of phone in the previous video, that a particular phone of mine, or maybe this pen that I have in my hand, does not have any interests, right? I can treat it the way I want to, and therefore our treatment of the objects as mere means to fulfill the utility that we confer them is not wrong. In this context, it may be perhaps a good idea to reflect on what we mean by objectification of someone then, what we mean by to treat somebody as means that Kant does not want us to treat someone as. Now, objectification simply means to treat someone as an object. And what is an object? An object is something that does not have any interest, does not have any desires, does not have any goals, and doesn't have any rationality of its own. So, if you are treating somebody as an object, it means you are treating someone as that who does not have interest, does not have desires and goals, is not a rational being, and therefore can be treated as means by others to fulfill their interests. And this particular thing precisely is what is problematic for Kant. So, according to Kant's second formulation of categorical imperative, no one should be treated as a mere means to achieve our ends. And when he's saying no one, he means specific, categorically no one, neither yourself and nobody else, regardless of what gender a person belongs to, what race a person belongs to, what caste community a person belongs to, what social strata the person happens to be coming from, right? No one should be treated as means to achieve our ends. Treating anyone in such a way, that is, using someone as means, like animals or objects, you would be stripping them of their human dignity or self-worth. That is, you would be stripping them of their status as rational agents with interests and desires, which happens to be, for Kant, the nature of a human. Alright, so you would be really depriving them of humanity, so to say. However, it does not really mean that you can't expect someone to work for you for just remuneration. So this is a clarification that I'm giving you sort of here. Now, if someone willfully works for you, exercising their free will and sees it in their interest in some ways, we may not call such voluntary exercise as a breach of the second formulation. Alright, so for instance, right now I am delivering this lecture to you people. Now, one clarification here that I need to give you. It doesn't really mean that you cannot expect anyone to work for you just for a just remuneration. Now, if someone is willfully working for you by exercising their free will and sees their interest in some ways in working for you, we may not call such voluntary exercises, such voluntary actions as a breach of the second formulation. So, for instance, I happen to be an assistant professor. When I'm teaching to the students, I am, maybe you can say that, treating those students as means, treating my college, my university as a means. And similarly, when the students are coming to the college in order to learn, they are treating their teachers as means to learn. But we all are coming there by exercising our free will, right? Nobody is forcing anyone to go there. I consider that it is in my interest to teach in the college in which I am teaching, and similarly the students who are taking admission there, they are taking admission there out of their free will. Alright, so we can treat others as means. What is problematic for Kant? To treat somebody merely as means, to not realize that they do have their own goals, they have their own interests. Alright, so if we treat somebody as means in a way that it is for our mutual benefit, in the sense our own interests are also served, our own goals are also served, then that is not problematic for Kant. What is problematic? To treat somebody merely as a means. Alright, so for instance, what would be those kind of actions? Say slavery. So when you are performing slavery, when you are practicing slavery, perhaps you are depriving those people from realizing their own goals. You are treating them as if they do not have any interest of their own. Similarly, women trafficking, child trafficking, right, and maybe child and bonded labor. So these are definitely instances where the second formulation is grossly violated. Now, so what I'm trying to tell you here, that how it is to act as a principle in order to justify your acts. So again, if you are to act in a particular way, ask yourself if by that action of yours, would you be treating yourself or someone else as mere means? Now, if the answer is an affirmative, then in that case your action is wrong. But if you would not be treating somebody as means, then perhaps it is your duty and you may do so. The act may be morally permissible. Now after that, we can have a look into what the third formulation of categorical imperative is. The categorical imperative's third formulation is the idea of the will of every rational being as a will that legislates a universal law. Now, it is a formulation that shifts its focus from an autonomous rational agent who is an adherent, who is a follower of the universal law, to the one who legislates it, right? The one who gives that law. So, rather than being the follower of the law, now you are the giver of that law, while exercising your autonomy as rational agent. Now, according to Kant, the autonomy of the rational being manifests when each member of the society, keeping aside the pursuance of their self-interest or hypothetical imperatives, exercises their rational will to arrive at maxims that validate their actions and others in equal measures without exceptions. In other words, what it suggests is that when we form laws that are universal, exercising our rationality, what we are truly exercising is our right to be autonomous, the right to govern ourselves. But since rationality, according to Kant, necessitates that everyone relying on it will arrive at the same conclusion, the laws formed as a consequence of it will have the acceptance of all. It means any restriction thus created is actually the exercise of our own freedom, our own autonomy, and therefore following it is also the exercise of this freedom. Now, so these are the three formulations that we have done. Now, with his three formulations of categorical imperative, that Kant has provided us, what he intended to provide at the outset was a way to arrive at a universal principle that can be relied upon to provide justification for acts, and while doing so he wanted to rely on human nature that exhibits autonomy, free will, rationality and interests. Alright, so that would be the end of the thesis that the Kant is providing. But the question is, did Kant actually manage to achieve what he hoped or thought he would achieve? With that, we are coming to certain challenges that have been put across Kant's thesis, or that can be put across Kant's thesis. So, as you may have understood by now, Kant's deontological ethics holds an unparalleled position in the pantheon of ethical theories. This is not to say that he was the first one to come up with the deontological ethics, but his version specifically of deontological ethics, meaning where he is combining the sense of duty with human nature, where he considers human is sufficient to arrive at the universal principles which can act as justification for human actions. However, in spite of its significance, there are aspects in his theory that remain unconvincing. Now let us have a look at some of the challenges that Kantian deontological theory doesn't seem to be addressing convincingly. Now, one of the challenges posed against Kant's efforts to theorize is that Kant asserts that humans have free will. Well, this is not a challenge to Kant's version of ethical theory alone. It probably is a challenge to all the efforts to arrive at justification for voluntary acts. If free will is not there, can we even have ethical theories? What is the point of judging someone's actions when they are not responsible for it, or when they can't be held accountable for it? Now, assumption of free will and rationality is a characteristic feature of the Age of Enlightenment, which undeniably has left an impression on Kant as well. However, the current understanding of our physical world and the laws governing it suggest that an assumption of an autonomous agent capable of exercising its free will might not be tenable, or at least what we can say is that a clear position in this regard remains unsettled at best. And in the absence of free will, perhaps we can't really talk about any ethical theory in general. So this particular objection, that it goes actually in all the ethical theories that we have done so far. We can't be held accountable for our acts if we do not possess free will. So perhaps the other way around to say it, rather than putting it as a challenge, what you can say is that to come up with any ethical theory, you would have to assume that an agent does have free will. But if we do not have, perhaps we can't really justify any ethical theory. Or maybe what you can say is that we can't really say that actions can be termed as right or wrong. If I cannot act otherwise, then so be it. Now, the second challenge that is put on Kant's thesis, or maybe I would like to advance on his thesis, would be that Kant's belief that all the autonomous rational agents, if they solely rely on their rationality to arrive at their conclusions, will arrive at the same maxim is untenable and very far-fetched. As Isaiah Berlin, one of the socio-political philosopher, puts it, going by Kant's views, it can be made out that all the philosophical disagreements in the world are between rational and irrational people only. Well, and that seems to be contrary to common sense. And is it not the case that most of the philosophy is a story of how two rational viewpoints can be at loggerheads with each other, where different justifications and viewpoints are very common, to say the least? Now, Kant's understanding of rational decision making in this regard is flawed from the point of view of our current understanding of the processes involved in the rational decision making. Herbert Simon's decision making theory possesses a serious challenge to this view. According to him, a rational decision making process involves choosing the best alternative from a set of all the available options to act. But the question to be answered in this context is, can we even be aware of all the options available to us at any given point of time? What it means is that the information at our disposal to make a decision at any given point of time is never complete or absolute. With time, new information emerges and the old becomes redundant, and the process is incessant. Thus, given this relative status of information, can we make the kind of rational decisions that Kant expects us to make? A decision that every other rational being would also arrive at, listening to the command of reason? Thus, to imagine that a universal maxim can be arrived at by anyone relying on rationality is perhaps again untenable. And in this sense, every command made by the exercise of our rationality is conditional. That is, it depends upon the current availability of information, and any information in the future may render the maxim untenable. So, for example, one should never lie is a universal command for Kant. But imagine a hypothetical situation where in future it is discovered that there is a genetic disorder that triggers the propensity of a section of the population to lie. Now, in the light of this new information, can you really make this law a universal maxim? The answer is no, meaning all the maxims in this sense are hypothetical in certain senses. Likewise, anyone with decent acquaintance with general laws of physics or the principles of physical sciences will concur that such principles can never be called as absolute, as newer information quite often challenges the old principles. So, for example, Newton's law of gravitation got replaced by Einstein's, and it's a certainty that, given our current understanding, that Einstein's too will be replaced one day. Now, when the principles of physical world are not absolute, and why am I alluding to physical principles? Because perhaps in the era of enlightenment, that is the impetus of these philosophers who were the part of the era of enlightenment to be so much influenced by reason, because following reason, sciences were coming up with universal principles to explain the workings of the nature. Now, what I am saying here is, when the principles of physical world are not absolute, is it not reasonable to believe that the universal principles to judge actions wouldn't be either? Now, that brings us to yet another challenge, right? Kant. Now, another criticism of Kantian approach to ethics is the assumption that there can be universal laws for every situation. Now, it is reasonable to assume that the world is not constituted of blacks and whites. Mostly, it exhibits grays, where it can often be found that there are situations where a clear principle is not applicable or can't be relied upon for justification. So, for example, if a person in rage is after the life of your innocent friend who is in hiding, but you are aware where he is hiding, now if that person asks you his whereabouts, would you tell the truth or would you save the person? Now, even in this condition, Kant would say that you should tell the truth, as you are not in the control of the consequences of your actions. So, it may so happen that your action of lying, despite your intention of saving your friend, lands him in trouble. Now, what I'd like to say here is that maybe my lying might have landed the person in trouble, but so is the case with telling the truth. My telling the truth may also land the person in trouble, and the other person may really kill my innocent friend. Alright, so this is an area where I can't really be sure of what principle should I base my actions on. Maybe, so what I really want to say is that perhaps I can't really come up with a universal principle to act on where I can justify my act. Now, similarly, a related issue with Kant's theory is the case of dilemmas, the moral dilemmas, where your duties come into conflict with each other. Now, modifying the example I just gave to you, now imagine that this time you are sure that your lying would indeed save the person. Now, isn't it the case that if you choose to save the person in the hiding, you would be required to lie? And if you choose to lie, you would be violating your duty to save an innocent. Now, if I happen to face this kind of a dilemma, how is it that I am required to act? Perhaps is not answered by Kantian thesis. And such situations make it difficult for us to rely on some principle to justify our acts, and even pose doubts over the reliability of such principles. Furthermore, once again, Berlin poses a very serious challenge to Kantian emphasis on the uniformity of the principles arrived by any rational agent, meaning any rational agent, if follows the path of reason, will arrive at the same principles that others like him would arrive at. Berlin argues that this Kantian position is susceptible to exploitation and injustice, and may lead to coercive intrusion into our personal liberties, the so-called interests that Kant himself considers as the essential element of human nature and our dignity. Now, what does Berlin want to say here? Now, you have already come to understand how even with rationality, people generally arrive at different positions. And if people are not using rationality, then perhaps again they may arrive at different positions, of course. But given Kant's requirements of universality and uniformity, those who are not in conformity with the majority or the influentials in their positions or standpoints may be regarded as irrational. So even if I am acting with reasons, but just because my views are not in conformity with whosoever happens to be in the privileged position, they may regard my actions as irrational, and they may, again in the name of rationality, they may coerce me into conformity with them or with the rest in the case of majority. However, according to Berlin, much worse than this treatment is the justification offered for such coercion. Now you will be told that it is you who wants this conformity. Had you been your rational self, you definitely would have wanted this. But since you have given into your desires and interests that are not rational, you are having a momentary slip. You are living your life by, so to say in Kantian terminology, hypothetical imperatives, where you have to really live by categorical imperatives. But we, on your behalf, that is, on the behalf of your rational self, your true self, would not let your irrational self to drift from the path of rationality. This is how, according to Berlin, Kant's version of rationality is a suitable tool in the hands of despots to curb the freedom of others, and what? In the name of freedom itself. Now, one last challenge is that Kant's theory, as you have observed, avoids any reliance on consequences of actions to categorize them whatsoever. To him, resorting to it only provides what he terms as a conditional good. But how far can consequences be completely disregarded to arrive at the notion of right and wrong? The example that I gave you just a while ago again is a good example where to choose between lying and saving someone's life. Now, the consideration of consequences might be more fruitful here in resolving the ethical dilemma than relying on a universal principle. Finally, one may also argue that the criteria of universality itself that is demanded by Kant is subjective in nature, meaning what? That everyone may not want to adhere to this criteria of universality. Meta-ethical reflections have revealed relativism and subjectivism are alternatives to universality and absolutism advanced by Kant's deontological theory. Now, this brings to probably the most significant issue that Hume has alluded to. That is, one can choose any way of justifying one's actions, such as universal principles in the case of Kant, or virtues in the case of Aristotle, or some form of desirable consequences in the consequential theories. But whatever justification one opts for, if once more it is asked why it is desirable to have such kind of justification, what could be the answer? Now, it's hard to come up with an answer other than what Hume provided, that is, such choices are exercised on entirely subjective grounds. Kant might respond by saying that his principles are unconditionally good, but one may again ask why the unconditional good has to be accorded the special status. Kant may say that it's the best way to realize a society where interests of everyone are protected, but a nihilist may argue otherwise. The crux of the matter is that it is difficult to shake away subjectivism even when Kant's theory or consequentialist theory or virtue ethics looks very reasonable in many instances. Now, does this mean that these theories are unworthy of being adopted? Well, such a stance would be very unreasonable in fact. Now, Aristotle's virtue ethics or else utilitarianism or Kant's deontological theory, right, whatever we have done in this series. Now, all these theories have provided us with potent framework to think about our actions deeply for ethical implications. And given our experiences thus far, it seems to be the case of that one size doesn't fit all, as there are facets of life where consequentialism triumphs over Kant's deontology, and vice versa may also be equally true. And it can't be taken away that his theory, along with others presented in the lecture series, are the most significant milestones in the province of Western ethics, where efforts have been made to arrive at general principles that can be relied on for the justification of acts, beliefs, and intent. Now, that brings us to the end of the entire lecture series of ethics in the history of Western philosophy. Now, to track your progress on specifically this lecture on Kant, I have given you a few questions here. So, for instance, you may try to attempt what are the three formulations of categorical imperative? How do these formulations aid a rational agent to arrive at universal principles? And why humans, according to the second formulation, shouldn't be considered a means to attain our ends? And the last question, what are the challenges raised against Kant's theory? That would be all. Thank you very much.